So based upon Franklin's speech and the suggestion again that there be some compromise where the small states would get one thing and the large states would get another, we finally passed the Great Compromise. It is also known as the Connecticut Compromise because a guy by the name of Roger Sherman from Connecticut, one of the Connecticut delegates, proposed the solution. So what the small states got out of the Connecticut or out of the Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise was they got representation based upon equality in the Senate. In other words, each state, regardless of size, would have the same representation in the Senate. Originally, it was thought to be one. They would get one vote, but they went with 2 senators. So every state, regardless of size, got 2 senators. Didn't matter how large or how small. In fact, there's only one portion of the Constitution that the Constitution says cannot be amended, and that is that representation in the Senate would be based upon anything other than state equality. So that's how strong they were on this issue, that the small states would get equality in the Senate. The large states got representation based on population in the House of Representatives. So in other words, here, really, the people are being represented. You can look at the Senate and say in the Senate that the states are being represented. And this gives the flavor to the Constitution that Madison didn't even anticipate at the beginning. And at first, Madison felt that this was a great travesty, that representation based upon population would not be had in the Senate. He was very disappointed. By the end of the convention, he said this, though. He said, like the centaur, half man, half beast. He says this is a creature, meaning the Constitution is a creature that I have never thought of before. And whether it will work or not work, I don't know. But I am willing to take the hazard. So eventually, even Madison, despite his great disappointment, would come around to see that this representation of states in the Senate was a good thing, and that representation of the people in the House of Representatives was a good thing. Now, further, because people would be paying tax bills, one of the concessions that the small states gave the large states was that all bills to raise revenue would begin in the House, where large states would have more of a say as to how they would be crafted, because it was their people, it was where most of those people were that were going to be paying most of the taxes. So this was a concession or a compromise within the Great Compromise itself. Now, after you get the Great Compromise completed, and both the small states and the large states are agreeing to this, it was a very close vote, by the way. A couple states abstained, and the vote ended up being 5-4. So it just passed in committee. Barely passed, but it passed. Once the Great Compromise passed, it necessitated another compromise. So if the House of Representatives is going to be based on population, how is it that you determine population? In other words, should slaves be counted? Now, the southern states wanted, of course, to count the slaves as population for purposes of representation. That's what they wanted. The North said, no, you cannot have it both ways. You can't say that they don't have the rights of all other human beings, but then get to count them for purposes of population. So we have this great sticking point. We have this great sticking point in the Constitution Convention threatening to unravel the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise itself. At any rate, the two sides finally agreed, but not without heated debate, which we'll get to in a second. So if you read the Constitution in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, so just as we'll save that. Article 1, which deals with the legislative branch, says this about representation and this issue of who's going to be counted for purposes of population in determining the size or how many representatives each state gets in the House of Representatives. So it says, representation and taxes shall be apportioned by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. And of course, by all other persons, they meant slaves. Now, they never referred to slaves in the Constitution as slaves. This is one of the euphemisms they used. So this is offensive. This is offensive, highly offensive, particularly today. So slaves were counted as 3/5 of all other people. Now, why 3/5? Well, it was believed, based on current populations, that this would give the South and the North kind of a parity in the legislature. It gave the North a little bit of an edge. The South was okay with that. This wasn't an exact science back then, as they didn't have the capabilities of communication that we have today, and with the population in determining it. But it was believed that they would give them parity. And so they settled on this compromise. Now, there was a lot of bitter debate even before the compromise took place. There was a book written called A Necessary Evil, speaking of slavery, A Necessary Evil. And what the author was trying to say, and he went through the history of what happened at the Constitutional Convention. What the author was trying to say was, without slavery, you wouldn't have had the dynamics. Without the North-South split, you wouldn't have had the dynamics that ended up creating this document that has been so revered in our history and really throughout the world. When I say that, because what's the alternative? And this is what he argued in his book. The alternative is, if the North would have insisted that slavery end, the South never would have joined the Union. And you would have had a southern United States and a northern United States. And the dynamics of the constitutions would have changed. And you would have these two warring nations at each other, which would have made us, balkanized us, very much like Europe. You look at the European Union today, what the European Union is trying to do today is what the United States did over 200 years ago. 200 and almost 50 years ago now. We did that 250 years ago almost, and they're still trying to figure it out with the European Union. Now, not everybody agreed, but they got voted out. So George Mason, he said this. He says, as nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, so they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities. Wow. Wow. So Mason warned the Union that if they didn't take care of slavery now, the issue would still arise, and it would arise in this world. Remember, as I said earlier, they're a very religious people. That's what informed them. That's how they understood things. And so he's arguing God can't punish people in the next world. So how does he do it? He can't strike that. He can't punish nations in the next world. So how does he do it? He's got to punish them in this world. And so he's warning that something will happen. So my question to you is Mason right? Was George Mason right? Or is this idea that God even punishes nations just wrong? Well, think about that for a second. And now we'll just go on and see what Abraham Lincoln thought about this. So this comes from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. Just a snippet out of it, and it really answers the question, at least for Lincoln, what he thought about what Mason said. Again, coming right out of his inaugural address. You can look this up online. You don't have to take my word for it. All right. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe unto that man by whom the offense cometh. So it's an interesting couple phrases there Lincoln uses there, and you might wonder, where did he come up with that? Did he come up with it on his own? And the answer is no. That comes right out of Matthew chapter 18, verse 9. It says, "Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh." That's the King James version that really he's quoting from. So moving on. So he says, if we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses. So he's saying this is his premise, and he believes that premise. And so he's saying, what if slavery is one of those offenses, which in the province of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. There it is, Lincoln's take on Mason's idea that there is a national calamity that will come. And if you look at what happened, with the Civil War, the low end of estimates of the number of people who died in the Civil War is 650,000. The upper end is about 900,000. You take the Civil War, even at 650,000, you combine all the other wars except the Civil War together. Fewer people died in all other wars in the United States than in the Civil War alone. So there it is. There it is. All right. That is a good place to stop. We won't have time to finish the next segment, so we'll stop right there and pick up with the next video on the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise.